This is Radical Spatial Futures, a project on spatial resistances, collective speculations and radical imaginations. You're listening to Confronting Radical Imagination, a conversation series asking, what is the role of spatial practice in contexts so deeply conflictual that alternatives are not even considered possible? In this reflective journey, I confront spatial practitioners from around the globe with the notion of radical imagination. What does it mean to them? Is it valuable? Is it an inherent part of design and spatial practice? What is the role of imagination in wider processes of change? The conversations are structured around a series of material agents, images, drawings, and quotes amongst others, which are carefully curated from the practice's past work. In this conversation, I am joined by Emre Akbil, Esra Can, and Socrates Stratis to together discuss the work of Imaginary Famagusta and explore the role and the mobilization of the imaginary. Imaginary Famagusta, or IF, is an informal bicommunal Cypriot collective of architects, planners, academics and activists from across the Cypriot divide, advocating for the role of spatial practice in reconciliation processes through the agencies of urbanism and architecture. The collective emerged from the urban contestations of divided Cyprus, initially with a focus on the city of Famagusta. The Hands-on Famagusta project was created as a platform for bottom-up spatial processes to support mutuality, coexistence, and peace building in interrelation with processes of urban regeneration through commoning. The HOF project was also exhibited as part of the Cypriot National Pavilion at the 15th Venice Architecture Biennale, titled Contested Fronts: Commoning Practices for Conflict Transformation. IF has since expanded its focus beyond the city of Famagusta, transforming its methodology towards an imaginary federalism, a unified Cypriot future. This episode might stand apart due to the deep connection of the Radical Spatial Futures project and Imaginary Famagusta, whom I have been involved in since 2016 and I am a member of since 2019. IF is one of the many starting points of the RSF project, and it also is the space in which its ideas developed and flourished, and where its initial situated explorations and hypotheses are based on. Hope you enjoy.
Hello!
Hi everyone!
How
Hi, Esra.
are you? Hi, Sophia. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Oh, it's so nice to see you.
It's
We missed you.
It's been so long.
It's true. How are
Yes.
you? You are like Sheffield residents now. So I should come and find you, I think. That's the only way to see you.
Maybe.
That's the best way.
Okay, that sounds great to us.
Yes.
So, let's start.
Okay, yes, let's start. Okay, this is a bit different. I was a bit confused yesterday. I was trying to prepare, to be honest with you, and I was slightly confused about how to approach this because I think I have a lot of questions for other people because I don't know their work very well. But this is a different type of thing. So I think we'll just, I'll just bring up some things that I'm interested in and we can have a conversation about them together and make sense of them, if that makes sense, through the work of Imaginary Famagusta. I was thinking about, because usually I tell people what this project is about and why I'm doing it. But for you it's quite different because I think this project is very much based on the work of Imaginary Famagusta and my experience kind of being a part of it for all the years that I have been with you. And I had written a pre-chapter in my confirmation review documents that was called A Letter to My Research, Exploring Personal Positionality, Situated Understandings, and Speculative Imaginaries. So this was kind of like a positionality statement of me saying, why am I doing this research and why is it important to me? So I thought maybe to start off, I will read a very small piece from this so you understand maybe what Imaginary Famagusta means for me. Okay, here I go. But what really is division? I crossed through to the other side for the first time sometime around 2004, right after the checkpoints opened up, in a bus full of aunties and grandmothers who were longing for their lost homes. I had grown up in their embrace, specifically my grandmother's. The house she grew up in and got married now had new inhabitants, army people that wouldn't let us look around. Back then, I only knew as much as school decided to say, and as much as my yaya narrated. Divisions, barricades, soldiers carrying guns, singing national anthems of other nations, and blaming the others for stealing our houses and killing our uncles, all that was simply normalized. parallel cities living parallel realities in very close proximities, and two languages and two religions separated by a void border built to keep people apart both physically and mentally. The other side, it was always there, but it became invisible along with the thoughts, dreams, and possibilities for different futures. But I know exactly when I blinked, but breaching is gradual. I was an aspiring architect in the third year of my studies, just some meters away from the buffer zone. An urban design project had to do with divisions and speculations of unifications. There is futures different from what I was told, and architecture isn't only related to building. Imaginary Famagusta came in and changed how I perceived what architecture is, what an architect does, how I understand the conflictual context of my country, and most importantly, what I want my own role to be within it. At once, I crossed and transgressed both boundaries of disciplines and of conflicts. And if you breach, you can't come back from that. So, in a way, I'm not reading anymore. This project is kind of based on these experiences, and there has a lot of starting points, as we were discussing a couple of days ago with Emre and Esra. But this is how it started, from me being engaged with the work of Imaginary Famagusta. And now it has become a bit different. It has been a kind of plea to open up for me and to explore how our work collectively with a lot of different other practices always says that there is an alternative, even if that alternative is only imaginary for now. So yeah, the project generally is focused on three different aspects, which are the urban conflict, critical spatial practice, and radical imagination. And in a way, I open up to find around the world a lot of different practices that do work that in some ways is similar to Imaginary Famagusta, but also very different. And they all work in some forms of conflict. But this conflict is not only because of ethno-national divisions, such as in the case of Cyprus, but opens up to include many types of conflict. And what I'm particularly interested in is this concept of the radical imagination and of how these practices, through their work, manage to create alternative futures and imaginaries. So this is sort of where this project is coming from. And I don't know, I just made this small introduction so you know why I'm doing this, if that makes sense, before I start asking you about your own experiences. Yeah. I don't know if you have any questions for me before we go into it properly.
No.
Or any reactions? No. You all seem incredibly silent. Usually you are talkative people, and now you're just all staring at me, so I feel...
I think when you were speaking about your personal transformation and experience, it was interesting for me to reflect on, my own transformation experience as well. I really liked how you have connected your maybe transformation by crossing the border. You associated it with the project that you have attended at the University of Cyprus. So there are always those thresholds that you cross and you're a different person afterwards. So I think it's really nice that you have captured that moment. This is something that I worked on myself in relation to urban activists as well. And it is really interesting that we cross those thresholds. It changes us, but that also means that we start building kind of new struggles and new fronts around that transformation as well. It changes us, and therefore our struggles change too. So I think when you were talking about your experience, that was also a self-reflection for me.
I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do it, because I think I also come from a different generation than you in a way. So when the crossing points opened, I was still a child. I was 11 years old basically. So I have a very, very different experience in relation, I think. with the conflict in Cyprus. So I think that's something that I wanted to ask you. I mean, what does the conflict in Cyprus mean to you, like on a personal level, before we go what it means to us as a group and how we deal with it?
Mm-hmm. Can I just continue? Because
of course.
Okay. Then others join maybe.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I mean, conflict in Cyprus basically changed in the demonstrations of 2003 and 2004. So with 2003, when we started for the first time confronting this status quo that was never to be contested, or shouting out in public squares by putting our hearts out there and against all the possible, worse consequences of being there as well. I remember there was this one public protest that we were going, me together with my friends, my sisters going together with their friends. And then my father called us on the way. He said, well, be careful, because they said that there will be a bomb in the square. So maybe you turn back, because we were on the road from Famagusta to Nicosia. We were going for the demonstration for reunification. And my father called us and said, come back, because they said that they actually implanted a bomb in the public square. And my sister's response was, Dad, I'm so sorry. If there will be someone dying today, I hope it's me. And oh my God, it was like, it's that kind of so it's not just a mental transformation. It's like it's an embodied transformation as well. And you're there and you put your life there as well. So that basically changed the way you become a different subject. You become much more political in the way you're approaching what's going on around you. And you also start on reflecting your profession as well. Then if that is the environment that I'm living in, what kind of an architect I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's when you start engaging with different projects. You start engaging with people across the border, coming from the same profession with you. There are so many projects that Emre and me, we were working together, so I'm sure he's going to reflect on those moments too. But being part of the technical team of Home for Cooperation, for example, was the first step, because they were the first people that I collaborated with who dared to approach the border differently. And then working on Dip Karpaz, Rizo Karpaz'a project changed things for me a lot as well, because I saw the actual meaning of coexistence, how coexistence is lived in the public areas, but also how it is lived in the backyards of houses. So what does it mean, and how I can approach this as an architect in different ways? How I can think about the space, the urban context, and how I can understand the dynamics of the urban context in different ways as an architect was interesting for me. And then, of course, Imaginary Famagusta and this deep collaboration between every unique person, not only across the border, but we also came in with our own knowledge and character, because it was a really deep kind of engagement, I think, between the group. We first started with understanding each other, and then that changed the project too. So it is always personal. It always comes from personal transformation, and then extends into, collaborations and projects for me. Mm-hmm. Yes, I will shut up and others will continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Emre.
No, go ahead, Socrates.
No, I think the major kind of challenge of this discussion is that it becomes psychotherapeutic at the same time. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we are discussing about, it's already 10 years ago, and a lot of things happened since then, you're all in Sheffield University, which I'm really proud of that, to a lot of the work we've done in the hands of Famagusta. So that's quite important to put on the table. In other words, it's not that moment that we are discussing about, it's this whole trajectory from our own kind of references to the conflict, to what's going on now. Having said that, I'm very happy and satisfied that even the status quo is not getting better, our trajectory is getting much better than when we met, just to put it that way. Having said that, it's again another issue which is quite important, that our positionality is so dominant. Therefore, any discussion goes through our experience. And it's true, I think what the Hands of Famagusta project that has done is to confront us with the narratives of the others. And I remember very well that moment. I think we were, after finishing the survey for Famagusta, it was July 2014 or 15, I don't remember, that we went to the EMU center on the seashore. And it was a moment when we had this questionnaire that was doing his PhD, and suddenly there was this crisis between the group because the questions asked, they were questions gotten out from a very kind of social scientific methodology, but it insulted the whole group. And that was kind of unintentional, but it brought out this, I would say, very difficult bridging of knowledge production and being engaged and immersed within the problem that we're discussing. So I think we have three generations here, and I'm the one that I have memories from the war. I don't know if Esra and Emre do, they don't. However, we have also this proof of generational transfer of traumas from conflict. Therefore, it's actually these layers of traumas that we carry with us because of where we live. And this process of transformation of ourselves, where I find so it goes the other way around, as I see it. It's not that we transform thanks to the projects, but the projects transform because of us changing. And then at the end, it brings another kind of, going back to this radical imaginary that you were saying before, that it's almost that all people in areas with conflict, they have to go through this process. That's the only way to change. Otherwise, they are kind of stuck in these loops of auto-references of narrative. Therefore, because it's leaps of faith. I mean, for me, a war was a trauma. I do remember it. I do remember where I was when there were the Turkish plane throwing bombs. And I remember my kind of, therefore, the lived-in experience of the war, it's not so easy, I mean, to change. So in other words, I can understand why there are still people who are very comfortable in being enemies. Therefore, the Cyprus conflict has this kind of capacity of not only kind of sustaining a status quo, but transforming its conflict in many other status quo in the name of the non kind of conflict. So I just stop there because
I really am really glad that, Lara, you decided to take on this notion of the imaginary and move it forward, because I think it's at the core of how we become the small community. We started to use it almost from the beginning as a protective shelf in a way. And then this radical imagination transformed itself from this future making tool, this projective tool, to a self-care tool. Yeah. So we started to take care of our, third space, this in-between space that was being created. And we started with these fictions of this duality of conflict, which is imposed by a colonial infrastructure. But then you start to see and dwell in these gaps of this duality, the fictional duality. So I think there's this double nature of this imagination or imaginaries. We started with the what if. We started to call ourselves if. Imaginary Famagusta. We started to play with it like imaginary federalism, imaginary future. So we started to play with that. We kept changing and it kept changing us. But I think the quality of this imaginary first of all for me was to give that space to reinvent my subjectivity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Beyond this dual subjectification mechanisms that is instituted in both sides. Because you cannot do it by yourself. You need a multiplicity to reinvent yourself as a subject. But all of the infrastructures, all of the institutions are against these kind of institutionalization. Mm-hmm. So you need to invent other forms of institutions. And this imaginary Famagusta, gave me this tool, this infrastructure to keep revisiting my childhood memories, make sense of them. So getting entangled in the barbed wires, dwelling next to the border, finding these evidence of violence as a 5-year-old, but not making sense of it, but building your subjectivity on top of this. Yeah. So like I said, there is this psychotherapical nature of our group, but I think it's embedded in this notion of imaginaries as an infrastructure of self-care together with the mobilization of a more political trajectory. Yeah. So there's this duality. So, imagining alternative futures while keeping a protective space of the imaginary as a third space for, reinventing our subjectivity, our collectivity, our friendship. So not just remaining in this disciplinary friendships, but also taking care of each other, responding to our, happiness, but also to some crisis in our lives. So I think it was, a really creative, tool that was, of course, offered to us, by Socrates, first of all, but then I think it was really good to keep this going, growing, and it's really nice to see you take this over, Dara.
Thank you. Before I go back to the imaginary, let's ask about the imaginary, because I know that it was that, so it was at the same time a way or a space, as I see it, to project for the future, but also to be together in the present. But then it also meant something in an institutional, maybe not an institutional way, right? It was tactical. I think I've had this conversation with many of you informally, but it was a way to call other people in and bring other people, that if this was a formal or more institutional or organized collective that had some legal status, they would not participate, right? So it was also a tactic in that way to keep this space as an informal projective space rather than something more formalized.
Yeah, I can just say a few things. I mean, I think what's important to understand, and maybe what is maybe different from other conflicts, like urban conflicts, this is a conflict that it puts under question the sovereignty of a state.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we operate in a vacuum, an institutional vacuum. And what was important so you need an architecture for generating kind of the milieu where we were operating, where that sometimes is not very obvious to kind of Northwestern or the global North way of doing spatial practicing.
Mm-hmm.
It's that they are already safe within their own kind of consensual institutional space. Even if they criticize it, the people who take part on it, they have a sort of a consensus.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, we are in a total vacuum, and I'm really interested in the vacuum, to be honest, because we can be very creative, tactfully. However, what it's important about Hansa Famagusta is that it took place thanks to complicities between different forms of organization. So Imaginary Famagusta was the informal one, then University of Cyprus was the sort of institutional one with Lucy, and then A and 2 was kind of the private one that was more flexible in doing things.
Mm-hmm.
So we could get money, we could frame, but then we could act and bypass words. In other words, the informality of Imaginary Famagusta was really appropriate because we generate space, kind of almost like a milieu, thanks to other kind of organizations in order to do that. And it was quite interesting because I was reading the other day, about Round Labor, and it's not formal. I thought it was an NGO or something. It's just not. And it allows them to be flexible as well. Therefore, there was quite wise what we did, to be honest. Of course, that prohibited us from applying for funding, and that was quite negative because at the end, this is another system of financing this kind of projects. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
But it was also a very different time when the group was formed in 2004 and 14, right? Around there. But that I think again, because of my age, don't exactly understand. And now I see also like a new generation that is my sister's generation, where kind of intercommunal projects in Cyprus are a completely normalized thing. And there is a lot of ways to do things and to start. But I have the feeling that when Imaginary Famagusta got first formed, this was not as common or as established to work between the communities.
Can we go back to maybe, because there was a major, I think it's what Esra said, 2003 was massive, and it was how the bicommunal initiatives before 2003 and after 2003 took place. Before 2003, the United Nations was a major agent of bringing people together in the buffer zone.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my first crossing over, it was before the 2003, when there was a Cyprus Architects Association collaboration with the Turkish Cypriot one, and we went to Velabais. I was sick for a week, because I felt that I entered a kind of a nightmare thing, because it's almost you go behind the mirror. So that's one. The second part is after 2003, and we started with Munever in 2000. It was just after I returned to Cyprus for my PhD, and we met. I think it was 2000. It was 2004. It was the Venice Biennale of Architecture. Paradigmata. It was the contribution to the pavilion of Greece in Venice. And thanks to them coming to Cyprus, I got to meet also Munever Fevzi.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think it was, at least for me, that moment that allowed us to start discussing about common projects, inviting each other to do things. And then Esra and Emre came in later on for 2011, I think, for the project we're doing for Famagusta. Therefore, the generation now, which I'm very happy to see that they are really organizing so many and so rich kind of initiatives about language. There is Hate, there is now there is Afua, there are all these people. I think that, first of all, it's thanks to the European funding, that there was not any back then, and that helps a lot, that discussion. Oh, to become even more fruitful.
Maybe I can just quickly add here, those institutions like European Union, United Nations, they also come with very bureaucratic processes. And in a space that is as conflicted as Cyprus, and we don't have violence, we have a very privileged conflict, don't we? We're not killing each other currently, at least. I mean, looking into what's going on around the world, we can say that it's a very privileged conflict. However, we are still navigating a very, very tense situation, let's say. So each and every one of us, we are very fragile within a very hostile system, even though there is no violence. So those bodies, when they approach Cyprus, of course, as Emre and Socrates said, they can't really see how their global north understanding of Cyprus does not really reflect what we are going through. So I was going to say, you get your European Union funding or United Nations funding, but then you also fall into a bureaucratic process within that. So one of the skills that civil society organizations, but particularly young people that I observe, one of the skills that they have developed is to learn how to navigate such bureaucracies, but then again respond to the realities of the context. So with all the projects that they've been doing, similar to us, with all the projects that we were doing, yes, we are, looking into Famagusta and imagining the features of Famagusta, but it always comes with a very political positioning and a very political motivation as well. We want to move towards a future where we live in peace, where we can transform conflicts. That's our ultimate goal. And the indispensable part of this is to cover for the time of people, and these funding are providing that, but we need to navigate it very carefully so that we will basically be peace activists that we are, but we will also do this through the city, through an urban context. We will involve as much people as possible and open this as a discussion platform for them, but also then fit into a very bureaucratic process of filling budget documents or showing how the events were organized and how many people have attended so that the numbers are, working. So there is this tension between, this observing global north powers and their ways of navigating the space and ours.
Yeah, there seems to be some shifts in the way that we interact as communities, as creating relationships. So we had this UN mediated relationships. Then we had before that we had the colonial mediated relationships. So there was always a mediator between these communities, until the gates were open and we started to create these alternative spaces. But still, in terms of institutional support, this mediation continues, as Esra pointed out. So when we're applying for a funding from the EU or United Nations, still you are being steered in a way. So we still need to find some alternative ways of navigating these spaces. But I think the one change that we have been advocating for is to transform the politics into this city-based politics. Yeah, so this urbanized everyday politics as a way to build relationships between communities, and that was, I think, Socrates and Minerva started to do these interventions to political parties. It was 2017 or 2018.
Yeah, I think it was 19, if I'm not wrong. Yeah,
was it before or after Crans Montana?
After.
So after the failure of Crans Montana.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so having the city as a way of relating to each other, I think that was quite a good alternative imaginary for politics that was put forward by this team.
I mean, I think we also talk about this often, and this is from those short videos that we had done for one of the presentation, where Emre talks about the commons, but also the urban space as a new language that we are, in a way, using to create a new way of talking, but also I see it as a way of understanding the conflict, because I think Imaginary Famagusta has a completely different way to approach the conflict in Cyprus and kind of move it away from the kind of ethno-national religious divisions to, I don't know, those four kind of aspects of urban space or towards common concerns. And I think this is, for me at least, is one of the most important tactics or things that Imaginary Famagusta is. This kind of new language of kind of transforming and shifting the conversation in a way.
Yeah, I think this was one of the first tools we had to invent for ourselves to talk to each other. And I think it helped that we were all architects and we had this other alternative language of this reading the city or trying to imagine the city differently. So that I think first gave us this tool to navigate out of our own narratives that we come with, that we were built as subjects before meeting each other, perhaps. But then I think this third language was somehow adopted as well by others. That was good to see. Famagusta Initiative and other bodies that we interact with, they started to use this kind of the not exactly calling it as the commons, but using this kind of narratives of shared coexistence spaces and these kind of imaginations.
I would just say a few things, and then I wanted to ask a few questions back to us, that I don't really have the answers either. But if you look at the kind of the anatomy of the conflict, of the narratives that they're produced because of the conflict, we see that even the discussion about the conflict resolution is based on private property, is based on private right, is based on neoliberal economy, in fact, it doesn't talk at all about commons. Therefore, there is this kind of double vacuum. Is the vacuum of institutions because of the conflict, and then there is a vacuum of publicness because of a neoliberal way of looking at how to resolve a common. And a third one, by saying that we need to live at peace by forgetting all our differences. And then there's that's why there's the resolution of the conflict and not any kind of transformation. We know, however, that we just need to live. We need to know how to live with conflicts. And what became crucial on our discussion with the political parties back in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, was that their relation, the relation of their narratives about the future of the island had nothing to do with space. Space for them is this neutral agent that whatever they decide, it will take place. And the power of Hans of Famagusta was that we brought on the table that urban space has an agency and it can work constructively or destructively to any efforts for conflict transformation. And that was, I think, what was quite interesting when we discussed with them, when they saw this big drawing with the map, and that I called the stand-up activism. And for me, that was a revelation, to be honest, to see the total absence of all these kind of things that I mentioned before. My questions were, how do we see the impact of Hans of Famagusta on both kind of sides since the last 10 years? And because, okay, on us, we sort of know because we talk to each other, we see what we do. And as I said, it's a success story. However, how do we see not only to the impact of Hans Famagusta to the two sides, but also to the rest of the initiatives that they take place? I don't know if you have any insight.
I mean, those were my questions for for the future of this conversation too, so I'm glad you brought them up. I also have this, I guess it's related, so I might bring it up, but it was quite interesting looking through different things that we have made in the past. So there is this one presentation that I think in the start, Socrates and Emre might have done somewhere, and then Emre and me are doing a version of this presentation to the students, showing them what the Imaginary Famagusta project is about and kind of the methodologies. And I don't know who had first written this because I think this presentation changed hands many times. But it talks about sort of the challenges of Imaginary Famagusta and how to sustain this sort of thing, but also that it has been unable in having an institutional change or policy changes, and how do we at the same time stay with the trouble but continue supporting other institutions with policy changes or even everyday practices. And then at the same time, we have, for example, this other piece that was from the chapter that was co-written for the Urban Commons Handbook, where it says that in a way, due to how Hans of Famagusta project was made, it chose to remain in the thresholds, and this is not something that is in a way bad. It's not a failure, but it was created as a resource or a depository or a toolbox for other things to happen in the future. So I think even between us, we might not be exactly sure always about how we define what is important or what the impact is, or where did we fail or where did we not fail. So that's something I wanted to bring up as well. And I'm glad Socrates did.
I think, I completely agree with Socrates that this notion of peace building is a very neoliberal concept, and this is how it is practiced in many conflictual contexts across the world as well. So the way peace building is approached by institutions, mainly in the north and in the south, it looks through that perspective too. So peace building, if it comes, if peace will come, it will come with development, mainly, yeah? This is how it is framed. It will come with building of new housing in copious amounts, so that there will be new opportunities and new life for everyone. So we'll just, forget about what has happened, because now we have these investments of a very wealthy future. This is how it is being sold to people. So suddenly when you go to them and come up with this urban commons agenda, it's like, what are you talking about? These people are promising us, lots of investments and development, and this is not necessarily your perspective. So I think that was one of the maybe barriers in telling these alternative stories and making them perceived by people, because what we're talking about necessitated a kind of investment from them, more like at a personal level, so that they can build communities around this alternative imaginary of commons. So I think that was a challenge that we had to face with. We had to reclaim a different way of peace building. Mm-hmm. We had to build new narratives of peace building that would be different from the institutional ones. So I think that was one of the barriers we had, and that's why it needed translation. That was my experience. I found myself several times within this last 10 years, 15 years, that I had to translate what we mean to people in personal conversations, but also within larger groups as well. I think you asked for impact. So one of the impacts I could say was during the master planning process initiated in the north. Well, as a group, we basically protested it because we were against any form of institutional planning of cities in a divided way. So we said, no, this is a wrong way of doing it, and we communicated this with the institutions as well. You should always collaborate and, imagine a future unified city, so that this could be possible in different ways in the future, but it could also change the way we think about those spaces now. And for me, one of the impacts was because I was part of the local urban activist groups that actually produced some response to that process. Me and Emre was able to translate some of the visions of hands-on Famagusta to the future visions of local practices as well. And that meant that, for example, we could sit down and talk about a public urban waterfront together with those people. I mean, what you understand from public, of course, again, it changes, right? However, we had the chance to sit down and, talk about this publicness. How can we approach it? What commons might mean? What having access to those spaces might mean? How we create those borders, and how can we dismantle those borders? Were actually issues that were discussed, and it found those discussions somehow they were translated into the reports, and then some of the descriptions eventually were adopted by the plan as well. So, I mean, it's not a huge success, but at least it is like creating those channels when you can somehow influence people to think differently about these spaces.
We tried many tactics, didn't we? I mean, there was the change.org petition. 750 people signed this common planning, not common planning tool, but common negotiation, or a joint committee for the common urban future of Famagusta. Yeah. So imagining this city as the common ground was a political call, but also we had this failure. We had this understanding of we would fail eventually, and I think we started to create these archives. So even the biennial was designed, created as an archive. The book had this image of the archive. The website, in a way, started to accumulate this archives. So I think that was from the beginning one of the strategies to deal with failure. You need some alternative resilience infrastructures, and creating archives is the best way to do this. So even if you cannot create actual change, you put forward a system of references, guides, so others can also pick up So this is part of an intergenerational thinking. I mean, it's not like we are doing this only for ourselves, but this is more like how do we live together in the future collectively? So this has been one of the success stories, I think, to create these archives and institute these alternative spaces where the project can survive in a different form. And coming back to this entanglement with the neoliberal actors, so I remember we had this one moment when we were trying to find ways of entering into the political debates, into the negotiation agendas of the two leaders. And we formed a sort of a collaboration with the Communal Famagusta initiative, who are actually mostly traders or representatives from the commerce boards, but they have access to leaders. And I was naive to join them so that we can put forward this notion of a joint committee for Famagusta. And we had these meetings with them. We prepared a common document to be shared with the president, and we arranged to meet with Akıncı. So it must be 2016 or just before 2017, before Crans Montana. So we are trying to convince them to not only go through this top-down process, but also to have this micro processes of negotiation, to bring communities with them in this reunification and peace-building process. And despite all the talks we had with this group of traders, the moment they got into the room, they just started to talk about investment. So they were not talking about reunification. They were talking about how much money could be brought, how investment can be raised once we start to invest in Varosha, in Famagusta. So it was more about bringing more resources, financial capital into this negotiation platform. And then I had to intervene and said, yes, but we also discussed about this collective document, that we present you this collective document. And they were like, oh, silent. So they'd say they didn't acknowledge our dialogue from before, even if we had this written common document. So coming back to this point of this notion of the negotiations being entangled with this privatized, investment-oriented, financialized negotiation infrastructure, I think this infrastructure is sustained and maintained and lubricated by this kind of access to these political infrastructures. So you can see them once you're part of those talks. So to the outside, they would say, okay, we are going for this alternative talk with the president. We want to talk about peace. Yeah. But they use this as a shield to talk about other things, to talk about profit, to talk about how to create new infrastructures for the future, new imaginaries that we don't really agree with, to continue investing and consuming the public and common spaces that we have. And then this becomes a double-edged sword, because it not only blocks this alternative imagination of the commons to be talked, to be discussed, to be debated, but it also blocks all the political resources that these power positions own, not to come not to flow into these commons and public resources. So I think that there is almost like a siege of these positions, these political positions, which is very continuous, very reproductive. And then we realize this when we're in it, but we always see the consequences from the news, from what we're seeing. So it's also, but that also convinces me that this urban scale, city level politics is the only way to escape these, because these positions are really easy to be seized and occupied by these organizations, because it's just one person. If you convince that one person, the whole political infrastructure depends on that one person or few persons. So it's important to decentralize this negotiation politics and reinvent how we make decisions, make debates about the future of cities, which then scales up from that scale.
I'm not sure how to put this, but I think one of the things that I always found interesting was these moments where, I don't know, because of roundtables or exhibitions or because of you going to a politician's office, suddenly you had conversations with people that you otherwise wouldn't talk to, and also put people together and different actors together across each other that wouldn't normally be around the same table. And as an act, that is really interesting because in a way I think the platform that the Hands on Famagusta project created allowed this, and these people also in a way stepped out of their shoes and started thinking about, I don't know, the agendas of the people across the table or of birds or of the river. And in a way there is no way of saying if this actually changed the way that they approach something or the way that they think or the way that they remember or the way that they discuss different issues around the conflict. Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm saying, to be honest.
I think this is something very difficult to measure now.
Yes, and that's what I mean. It's really difficult you cannot quantify this.
Yeah. I think you cannot quantify it, and maybe it is, all of these instances, we were very passionate about them, but at the same time we knew very well that it was not going to make a huge difference, and we were okay with it. I think in that sense, radical imagination maybe it's also about failures. We know that we're going to fail. However, we know that it's not just completely failure. That there are all the gains within the image of failure. There are many gains that we're going for that. We know that it's going to be at a scale that maybe you can't measure. However, it changes something in people. That's what we want to believe in. So, and because it is about failures, it also continues to necessitate reinventing and regrouping. Because you failed, because you need to reinvent how you talk about things and who you talk with, and you need to regroup continuously, because failures at the same time it means that you get tired in the process and the system gets tired too, so you need to continue to regroup and find power in each other, and because radical imagination is about that at the same time. I don't know how others feel about it.
First of all, I have a question for all three of you. You are all based now in the UK. You are 10 years away from the intensive part of Hands on Famagusta, which is still running, by the way. So we're not talking about the past. I have to just put an emphasis on that. But how has your positionality changed vis-a-vis the potential role, not the role that have projects like Hands on Famagusta? in Cyprus. How this geographic distance changed your point of view?
I think for me, and that happened during my PhD process as well, for me it was the realization that through our intensive efforts, at many times at personal costs, through our intensive efforts, we have created this Imaginary Famagusta body and hands-on Famagusta project that eventually maybe turned into a cluster itself as well. This is what I see in reflection from a distance. I wish that it was possible to maybe establish connections where we could have more effect in the ground by mobilizing people, because we created, it was very difficult to manage, because we had to create this protective space because it was, practicing within very tense conditions. However, then again, this potentially turned into a cluster. So within ourselves, for example, we created a language that was very difficult to translate. However, if maybe we were more inclusive in different stages, it could have been easy to find those words that could respond to what was happening on the ground. So I think that's one of the, not the criticism, but it's more like, maybe that could have been a way to have better impact in the space. That was my feeling, revisiting what we did after 10 years from the very intensive period, and maybe again finding these moments of reflection with urban activists too, because I could see that there were potentials in the space that could change us too. So it's not only us that is coming up with this, creative vision of an alternative future. There are many alternative creative visions of alternative futures in the ground that maybe we couldn't connect with in very productive ways, let's say. That was my feeling in reflection.
But listening to Emre is that, I'm smiling at the same time, because I think we went to we went to the most improbable places, and we made these surreal alliances. And so on one hand, it was, I don't think what you're saying, Esra, that one can cancel out the other, is that we were at the same time generating our kind of safe bubble, but then we were all the time kind of trying to talk to in the language of others, even kind of translating to the others what we wanted to do. However, I think that was, the last kind of initiative of going and finding the politicians with the drawing, and when you came in the summer as well, I think that was a success, because we got there okay, but it was then the opening of Varosha that totally killed everything.
Yeah.
And so it's not that we are, things change, like even the status quo, even the length of the status quo in 40 years or in 20 years, in 50 years is a totally different status quo. Therefore, in this kind of trajectory, what I found, it was that, it was not, it had this dynamic that one had to understand and face, but then understand also that there was no kind of possibility of doing anything. Another, why I'm asking you this? Because I think that the impact of our discourse, of our words, went, and it's impossible to find out. That's the magic of it, to be honest. Within the narratives of many, many different kinds of people. However, when you say Hanzo Famagusta, I think it was a more kind of recognizable word in the north part of the island rather than in the south part of the island. And I'm just wondering, okay, I kind of know why. However, so that's kind of one, how all this material that Emre was saying, that generating archives because we knew that those were necessary because of the failure. And I would just put it the other way around, isn't it this a methodology that one needs to do in order to keep rehearsing alternatives, knowing that it's just a rehearsal? Hopefully other people will rehearse it as well in their own way, as you do it when you present the project to your students in Sheffield, for example. Or as we did it when we worked on the markets for doing another kind of controversial kind of issue. Therefore, archives are part of them, of this generation of a material proof of out of space, because we knew that any engagement with the spatial reality now, other than influencing a potential master plan that we didn't agree with, it was impossible. Even if we discuss about what was the audience of the project, it was so diverse and so dispersed that you couldn't really go to a neighborhood and talk to all of them, for example. So when in one of the stories that I wrote in the book, that was actually the first crisis, that, okay, when you say commons, when you say kind of community, when you say participation, who do you refer to? And there were all these kind of divergent groups that they were with their own agendas, powerful ones that one had to deal with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I can answer your question, Socrates, from my point of view. So I think leaving from Cyprus in that moment, I don't know. I left because I wanted to do a master's, which is okay. I ended up here in Sheffield. But I think having a conversation with other people outside of Cyprus about the work that we did and why I personally thought that it was important, which is might be very different than why other people think it was important. It allowed me to reflect on it in a way that in a way I couldn't do that in Cyprus because I was so inside the situation and very much entrenched in it. So I think the distance allowed me to take a bit of a moment and look at and think about what we did. And I think I started, and it's also how this project was formed in a way, because it changed so many times, but the core was always about this idea of practicing and this idea of the future, and how we, through creating in this sort of alternative architectural practices or critical spatial practices, or however you want to call them, is, Socrates, what you said as well. It's in a way we think about the future, we know what the big picture is, and in a way we have an imaginary of what we would like that to be, but this is not very possible for us to reach. So we take a pocket of that and we do it in the present, and that's it, by all of these instances that the project created of people coming around together and discussing and things like that. Even if that doesn't have any measurable change in itself, it's in a way of us putting there how things could be in the future. And I think that changes not only people that participate in it, but also it so slowly shifts the narrative about how things could be. And I think this is what I was feeling in Cyprus, inside of me. And then I needed to take a bit of space to actually formulate it in my head that this is what was important for me, at least. And also I think through discussing with other people, because whenever I talk about this project, it takes people time to understand what I mean and why I'm trying to do this, and why instead of focusing on one or two specific case studies and localities, I want to open up and talk with a lot of different practices. And I think that's and that's the one thing. But I also acknowledge that I need to be in Cyprus at some moment, and I want to be in Cyprus, and I want to create the conditions that I can be in Cyprus and be in the ground and work on the ground. So it's a double thing. I think the distance has some good aspect to it, because you're also freer to talk and to express things. That might also be a personal thing, but sometimes in Cyprus, it depends very much on the circle that you are in. But in with specific people, I don't always feel 100% confident in actually saying and being very projective about what I'm doing and what I'm thinking. And I think the distance allows me that. But then on the other hand, it doesn't allow you to be on the ground and find those situations that Esra was talking about, where you can plug yourself in and actually be useful. So it's a double-edged sword again, I think.
I think for me, this the distance allowed me to start to think about the gaps that we left in our own narratives and in our own analysis. I mean, we talked about this between us quite often, and lately in the market project, we started to talk about it, this colonial axis, and how the urban environment was shaped, and how it shaped this duality. This fiction was created through this colonial imagination imposed on both communities. But I think the tools and the devices that we produce is very embedded in the present conflict, but it doesn't really unravel this infrastructure which brought this present on us. So we didn't really build tools of critique strong enough, it may be impactful enough to talk about how this division was brought upon us. And then this becomes more relevant in out of Cyprus context, because then you have a common language to talk about and share your story with other colonized or post-colonial territories. So maybe I think this archiving process misses a bit of the reinterpretation that is necessary for reinterrogating, reinventing histories of the Cypriot territory. So we can imagine the future, yeah? So there is this book called Future Histories, which tries to do this for on a planetary scale. And I think for the Cyprus scale, we also need our own future histories, alternative archives of how we imagine this deep history that has caused the present to appear in this way, because the responsibility of the colonial infrastructure is almost strategically removed from all of the narratives, and we shouldn't be complicit in that. We should bring that responsibility back to the table. I mean, now having these forces, these military bases, which is being used in the Middle East within the Cypriot territory, that is not being heard outside of Cyprus, but in Cyprus there is some voice. I think we need to maybe find another channel of archiving next to this archiving process that we were building for alternative visions of the city.
I think also adding to what Socrates, because you mentioned teaching and how the students here in Sheffield maybe what they take from this. And I think it's really interesting because this is not all Emre teaches about, of course. It's just one lecture here that me and Emre just turn up and discuss this. But I think a lot of what Emre bases the modules on, and he can talk about as well, has to do with this sensitivity and care about how you approach practice, but also understanding history and understanding space and urban conditions. But I would say some of the tools that we have developed, like the what if questions in particular, but also the ways of creating the spaces where actors come with their agendas across each other, and the way we had developed it later on, even in the market workshop that you mentioned. I think this has been an incredible tool for some of our students, because the moment we sort of introduce that and play a bit of a similar scenario where they kind of come up with their own what if question, it in a way transforms the way that they think about practice and the way that what the role is and what it could be as an architect or an urban designer. And I think that's in a way a very powerful thing that many other practices do in some similar sorts. But I think the tools, the way that they developed in the Hands-on Famagusta project and then later on in the other things, they are incredibly valuable, like even on their own as a methodology of practicing.
I mean, I remember kind of two moments. One moment was when we finished our presentation. It was part of Build Peace kind of conference when Esra and I were giving a lecture. And then Esra came to me and said, these friends of us, they say that we are too optimistic. But then she actually thought that they were wrong, So I think, and that was one moment. Then another moment was when I was so kind of, because you were really part of this project, that Maria looked at me and said one evening I went home, it was really, really kind of a wreckage. And she said, Socrates, when do you see an exit out of this project? I mean, when do you think you will stop working with this project? Because looking at you, well, maybe, you have to think about that. It's almost, you're not going to save the kind of, the property owners of Famagusta, because it's them that they want to prevail, kind of. So I think in both cases, what was coming out, that first of all, it was that the moment that we are, every moment we hop on, kind of, if we can just call it as kind of a bubble, but it's dynamic, then the optimism of will gains over any kind of knowledge that can make us pessimistic. And that's powerful, because if we say, I just sent you an email the other day, why not do this? I'm sure if you jump in, we'll be definitely sure we're going to save Cyprus again once more. And so that's powerful. And that's, I would say, a way to keep rehearsing. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm really glad to hear that kind of the methodology that we use, it's very helpful. It's a very good pedagogical tool, I'm sure, because I have tested it in many kind of students' courses as well. What Emre was saying, and I find that very important, is when Hands-on Famagusta was designed, it was designed for a very specific reason. Therefore, it sort of missed a critical take on the colonial machine that has produced it, as he said. And I'm sure many of us since then have added that, but it would be quite interesting to see, okay, how is it possible those tools to enter that aspect of it? And I think they could. And don't forget that if you read the link of the website, mm-hmm. it's totally different from the lingo we used in the book. And it's again different from some of the articles we wrote later on. Therefore, the transformative aspect of our discourse between public and commons, it's very clear and obvious in our own narratives, in our own writing. And that I remember once there was a colleague who said, your web platform scheme it's very successful because it's very inclusive in terms of not being very ideologically biased, she said, which I found it as a negative part. And so it's interesting to go back and study the kind of the language we used in the English language, because then when we translated into Greek and Turkish, I think we already became more suspicious and more about the words. And translation, I think translation that Esra mentioned, we've done a lot of translation between not only ourselves to keep in contact, but also with the rest of the people around us. And the article of Yorgos Flores is quite interesting, I think, to read about this polyphonic way of putting different kind of conflictual narratives coexisting within a narrative project, which I find quite fascinating.
I think this connection with the past is incredibly important because in a way, I mean, I think we did it, but not obviously, not explicitly in a way. And I agree that it would be really interesting to go back and see how the tools that we use and the imaginaries that we create for the future kind of come, and I don't know how they relate or how they reframe or how they can be used to go back and then to go to the front as well, which is really interesting. But I think this thing with the language and with being a bit like under the rug, I think this is also what I was saying before about, I think when I'm in Cyprus, I tend to do that unintentionally. Like when I talk to people, I tend to like put the politics a bit under the rug depending on who I'm talking to, or then put them out. But I think this is now what it allowed me to be here and be like, okay, this is actually straightly and strictly political in a way, and I have a very specific position. And I think for me it's important to acknowledge that I need to claim it more openly, and but that is very vulnerable in a way. And I think when you do it in a group, it's much easier to put it out there, if that makes sense.
I think that translation aspect is very important, and this is something that we started looking into here as well. Because we were translating information from theory to practice. We were translating information from between civil society organizations and institutions. We were translating information from our mother tongues to English and then back to other mother tongues. So there were many translations going on within the group and within all the relationships that we were establishing. So, I mean, this was a challenge that we faced as a group, but I mean, going back to your focus about radical imagination, Lara, I mean, imagine all the translations that happen through that process. And it's interesting to capture what is lost in translation, but what is gained in translation as well. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to do it, but yeah.
I mean, I think the radical imagination has this, essentially this kind of focus that goes, I mean, from the present, recognizing that the world needs to change and dreaming of possibilities for the future, but it's also about remembering and understanding and visibilizing the power and the structures and the infrastructures of struggle and oppression that has led us to today. So I think it's in a way, for me at least, and then also inspiring solidarity and action with these pockets in the present. And I think for me at least, I don't know, when I first read about this, it just kind of formed in my head that this is what we were doing essentially. And it's quite interesting because other researchers and theorists, when they talk about the radical imagination in social movements, they say that this is what social movements need, but many of them don't have. So they do not have this ability to understand and imagine the future. But what I think is that a lot of practices like ours do this without even trying to. This is what they do, because I think as architects and as designers, we are projective from our nature. And then when you put the political aspect kind of into play, you have this moment of like creating imaginaries and counter-imaginaries of what exists right now. So I found this a very interesting kind of play and imbalance that is quite different in our kind of field and subdiscipline. And I think from the conversations that I started having with a lot of different practitioners, it's something that a lot of them do, but they don't talk about, or they don't necessarily understand that they're doing it without reflecting back on it. So in concept, what I'm doing is just taking this idea and this experience of mine from here and giving it to other people and seeing how they relate to it, but also what it might mean to them and how we can create a common language with them as well to talk about how this sort of form of work, what it might mean, outside of always talking about very specific impact or change, or the way we talk in funding applications of how many people participated and the questionnaires and stuff like that. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I keep smiling. So, and the reason I keep smiling is that, I mean, seeing you, Lara, working on this project, it's a success. It's a major success of what I think we started kind of so many years ago. And I'm really curious to see how, like, your project, but also your career will move on to put that kind of to just take it to another level of translation. What you're saying and made me think is that when you discuss about, okay, I don't think we were a social movement.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I don't think
so
necessarily.
It's what's missing. Maybe it's what's missing from social movement. So if, for example, I think the archive, both at the Venice Biennale, but also the web platform, I think especially for the web platform, could have been useful if it could have been kind of generalized or scaled up to be kind of handy to social movements. In a way, how can social movements can kind of enrich their imagination, right? Use the hand of the platform, and so the techniques of this technology, this ad hoc technology, as we called it, we had the luxury because I think it was all artificial, just to put it that way. So there was not really a crisis. There was not really because social movements are generated when there are a few parameters that generate people to go out on the streets. We were not there. It just happened because of some kind of political timing events to be able to get the funding. We should not forget that our funding was from the United States of America. I'm not very proud of it, but that's how things started. And the whole point, however, is that we had the luxury to design this way of imagining it. And it was a kind of a multi-author way of kind of putting all this discussion together with all the debates that were going on, because we didn't come out of the blue there. Every one of us just put their own kind of intellectual baggage inside. Therefore, I still see it valid. That's what kind of powerful for this project. But it's still, when I look at it, it's like, why? Why not? Yes, it can work. Okay, it never worked. Even that game that we created was a total kind of failure. But the machine is there, is still working. By the way, I managed to get with our kind of IT colleagues, so the Hanzo Famagusta is moved to another server, so it's still safe because it's archaeology for ITs. And so we need to think how we go, if we consider that version as a beta version, what could have been the final version? And that could, maybe your project could be very useful to this collective, just to put it that way. Just turn around your interview, how you can be useful, because you said you want to come to the ground, but the ground is up there. It's kind of this kind of network thing. And it might be quite interesting to see how you could turn it around.
But first of all, this is kind of exactly what I'm trying to do. And we had this conversation in a seminar a couple of days ago. So, and someone mentioned to me, while I had not understood this, that this research is not about practice or is not practice-led or based or anything, but it's for practice, which is what my intention is. And this is not just our practice, but it's a range of different practices. And it's also about taking ways that they manage to produce these imaginaries in their own contexts and seeing how does this come together, what are the commonalities, the links. But the other thing that I would say, I think every single one of us in a separate way, and of course the other members of IF as well, take the work that we are doing in a specific direction. And what you mentioned about social movements and the relation of social movements with the work that practices such as ours do is exactly what Esra's PhD is about, that she should present to us at some moment. But I think it's about this possibility and the link between practices that have this ability and this luxury and this privilege to find space to design these ways of thinking, of creating imaginaries with other people that react and that are there on the ground to do things. And I think that's what Esra is doing. So I think it's very important for us to take also our individual kind of paths and transform them, but then in a way come back together and say, how do all of these things that we learn and we theorize and we base practice on individually, how do they come back together and support what we are doing?
So regroup.
Yeah, a regroup. I think we need a
regroup to reinvent ourselves.
We need a regroup, maybe one every, I don't know how many months. That exists there to say, okay, what did you do in the last 6 months? I don't know.
But it always starts with, an email such as the one that Socrates sent us recently.
It's a sleeping beauty and she wakes up when something...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, are you in? Should we, give it another go? I mean, I love that Socrates comes with such, triggers of, pushing us to, come on, there is this opening. Come on. Yeah, those are the moments to, as you said, Socrates, find the strength and we were saying vulnerability makes us stronger when it is shared, right? So it is through our shared vulnerability, being aware of it and building our strengths around it as well. So I think those moments of regrouping is important to bring in our vulnerabilities and strengths and build something more, strong together again.
I mean, when I went I think it was last October, to Limassol to visit the Famagustian mayor, I said to myself, and I was carrying the drawing, okay, because that drawing it's kind of such a dear ally. And so when I enter into that space, which is it's a horrible space, I mean, you want to go throw yourself out of a balcony when you enter in the space. And then the drawing was on the floor, and suddenly they had to rearrange the whole space. And I said to myself, okay, now we can hope again. And that was the moment that because I mean, there's a moment you say, okay, why do you want to fail again? And then it's, that moment that when I realized that they were also thinking kind of seriously, yeah, why not? And that's well, it took me 2 months to send you the mail. And I think we'll take a few more if we're going to do or anything. However, what I find fascinating but scary at the same time, it doesn't need a lot of energy to push again and restart or regroup. Yet, to find that energy, it might take centuries. So the whole, and then at the end of the day, such a personal thing, which it's again scary for me. Therefore, how is this discussion about collective go back to the individual? Mm-hmm. And how this kind of, because there was a moment when we were going with Munever to see one of the politicians, I don't remember where exactly in whom, but we're just discussing about this notion of just, I don't remember how was it, but how it's thanks to these initiatives that then you can feed back your energy and keep going. So it's a loop. And the problem is if you cut the loop short, then it's very hard to start again. And we should not forget that we are all part of the academia, and that academia does generate energy for us. If we are all in practice, and practice like in Cyprus, where 99.9% are people working for private investment, I don't think you have even energy to confront yourself of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the luxury that we have there. We should not forget.
Yeah, it would have been good to have Munever to contribute to that point, but perhaps the one of the reasons that she couldn't perhaps make it today is an evidence for that, maybe. Mm-hmm. But again, to come back to this notion of the individual or the self, again, I want to repeat that this radical imagination, this provisional space, this space of rehearsal that Socrates talked about, is a tool to deal with uncertainties, is the tool to deal with, so there's now a new phrase called radical unknowability. And so it's entangled with radical imagination, I guess. Mm-hmm. Because this is how the future is kept open. This is how the future, you can keep enduring, sustaining, caring for yourself within a very uncertain future. So I think these methodologies of how we practice within this Imaginary Famagusta, hands-on Famagusta project is becoming more and more relevant, not only within conflicted spaces, but the planetary breakdown demands from us to invent these kind of tools and methods. And this is what we, in the course of urban design, kind of frame the whole structure of the program around. How do we design collectively with others during a planetary breakdown? And this is how we learn from these kind of projects. And of course, hands-on Famagusta is one important part of it. And then Doina brings in another angle to it as well, the resilient urbanism, our urban projects and things like that. But I think this is a medium that we can keep reproducing, building, and your maybe thesis also contributes to this kind of space as well.
Mm-hmm. I think interestingly what you were saying, both to Socrates and Emre, and what is also what others are saying about the radical imagination, is that it's like, it's not a thing that exists or a thing that we can understand or that we can do. And it's also not individual, so it kind of transforms this idea of imaginaries that usually are seen as something that we have either individual or as some that we have like inherently or through collectives, but the idea is that we do it together, and it's a verb, like you're doing this thing, and also then it creates this landscape that is imaginary but also of the reality that is common between a lot of people, but it's also not exactly the same, which is what we are talking about here. Like it's a landscape that is common between us. It's a way that we do things and that we move on forward and that we practice or teach, but it doesn't have to mean that it's the same exactly for each person. So I think that's an important distinction.
And I think it's important to also get back to the ground as well. There is this radical imaginary, but then if we want to achieve a better future altogether, we need people, we need communities, we need institutions, we need procedures, we need policies, right? So it is definitely beyond that person. It is a collective action. It needs to be a collective action, and it needs multiple actors, for sure. And I think that's how a radical imaginary it gains value through sharing, through collectivities as well.
The Confronting Radical Imagination conversation series is hosted, written, researched, and edited by Lara Sharaf. The conversation series is part of the Radical Spatial Futures project, funded by the ESRC, supervised by Professor Doina Petrescu and Dr. Tanzil Shafiq at the School of Architecture of the University of Sheffield. Special thanks to Emre Akbil, Esra Can, Socrates Stratis, and Imaginary Famagusta for joining the conversation. Follow our work on our website, Instagram, and Facebook. To follow the RSF project, check radicalspatialfutures.com or Radical Spatial Futures on Instagram. Playing in the intro and outro is Fairy Tales by Daniel Zambo.